This event that is now considered the first Paralympics was, in fact, to give its full title, called the 9th Annual International Stoke Mandeville Games, which is a sort of hilarious idea because Stoke Mandeville is a hospital in Buckinghamshire. We'll explain why in a minute. And this was the first time that what had been the Stoke Mandeville Games, which had been an annual event, started running in the same 4-year cycle in the same city as the Olympics. The Olympics had just happened in Rome.
Yeah, and the athletes competed in 8 events over a week. Some of them that you wouldn't find in the Paralympics lineup today. There was archery, there was dartchery, which was kind of a British twist on archery that involved firing at a dartboard. Athletics, swimming, basketball, fencing, and snooker. Italy, the home nation, topped the medal table. And the event received positive, but I think from our perspective of today, spectacularly patronising coverage. Said the New York Times, "These handicapped persons could easily have withdrawn from normal life. Instead, they have chosen to take a step in the opposite direction and stage their own Olympics. The courageous wheelchair athletes give their all in such difficult sports as basketball, swimming and track." And that wheelchair comment is significant. All of the 400 athletes competing had suffered specifically spinal cord injuries, which reflects the competition's roots.
It was pioneered by a man called Dr. Ludwig Gutman, who was a respected Jewish neurosurgeon who had been forced to flee his homeland in Germany in 1939 to escape from the Nazis. And 5 years later, he was asked by the British government to open a spinal injuries unit at Stoke Mandeville intended to treat soldiers and civilians injured during the war. And as part of his treatment for the injured veterans, Gutman promoted sport as a means of physical and mental rehabilitation, and so came up with this idea of an organised competition, and it just began to develop from there.
Prior to this, a spinal cord injury was a death sentence. You know, if you were in the military and you injured your spine and you became a paraplegic, you would be sedated by high levels of drugs, you would be left hospitalised, and you would probably be bedridden until you died. And it's amazing, actually, if you look at the statistics, since this is directly connected to the war, obviously, and injured service people during the war. After World War I, 80% of patients died from a broken spine. Only 11% of Gutman's patients at Stoke Mandeville died from their injuries. So this concept of sport being part of your recovery, but also other pioneering things like, for example, he would get the nurses to tell the patients their life stories to give them a sense that they can still have a conversation and be active in community. He would get staff in the hospital to compete with the people in wheelchairs themselves in wheelchairs so that everyone was on an equal playing field. All of this was pioneered by Gutman in the UK and has gone on to be reflected in spinal cord treatment around the world, including in Italy, which is how we end up in Rome on this day.
Yeah, and Gutman had hired an army fitness instructor to bring in a new program of exercise and sports modified for wheelchair-bound patients to build up their strength and to keep them feeling mentally stronger as well. And then in 1948, the Olympics, the first post-war Summer Games, were due to be held in London. And so Gutman decided that he would arrange an event for his patients on the day of the opening ceremony, which he called the Stoke Mandeville Games for the Paralysed. And it was basically an archery contest. It was 14 men, mostly ex-servicemen, and 2 women, all with spinal injuries, taking part in wheelchairs. And I think it was intended not only to restore their confidence, their pride, their self-worth, but also to show their family and their friends and the wider world that there was hope and value to their lives. You know, as you said, spinal injuries were seen as hopeless, and paralysed patients often just withered away. Everyone assumed that that was the end of their lives, that it was just sad and depressing. And this was a way of saying, look, we're not hiding away. We don't need to be, shut away in bedrooms. That their family and friends could come and not see them as like, oh, something sad that had happened in their family, but something to be proud and happy about as well.
And then also, Gutman got them to play against local football clubs because the first sport that they played was wheelchair polo, which was this hybrid form of polo and hockey that was played with these foreshortened sticks, but it ended up resulting in so many injuries to the people who had already been injured and also the people who hadn't been injured that it was replaced with a form of like basketball. And then came archery, as you say, Rebecca, and that was the first one that opened the first Stoke Mandeville Games. But I think that sense of competition between people who had already suffered an injury that had left them with a disability and people who hadn't was the thing that was just just a remarkable innovation that is also mirrored, I think, in the Paralympics itself, which is, just another competition. These days, you've got the Olympics and the Paralympics, and people get behind both almost equivalently.
Yeah, and soon more than 100 people were competing in the annual event from various spinal units and hospitals around the country, as well as some of Gutman's former patients who are now living at home. The disciplines were expanded to include table tennis, javelin, netball and snooker. And in 1952, word had reached the Netherlands, which asked if it could send 4 ex-servicemen from a rehabilitation centre to participate. Ambitiously, this now 2-country event was renamed the International Stoke Mandeville Games. It was the first ever international parasport competition. And this was exactly what Gutman had hoped for. And in his opening remarks that year, he expressed the wish that, quote, one day the Paraplegic Games would be as international and as widely known in its own sphere as the Olympics.
It's only actually happened every 4 years in the same city as the Olympics since 1976, despite this first one happening in 1960. And in the early days, just the logistics of trying to get athletes from around the world to compete was very difficult. Access to travel, for example, still not ideal. You often hear about people in wheelchairs being stranded on the plane waiting for their assistants to turn up. But, in the early years, athletes would have to be lifted onto planes with a forklift truck to get to where they were going, because people weren't used to transporting disabled people on mainstream carriers.
Yeah, and I think the simple truth is that those early high ideas about what the Paralympics could one day be just took a long time to bring into the real world. Because in 1960, the International Working Group on Sport for the Disabled was established by the World Federation of Ex-Servicemen to address issues related to sport for individuals with impairments. And this led to the formation of the International Sport Organization for the Disabled in 1964, which included athletes with vision impairments, amputations, cerebral palsy, and paraplegia. And initially, 16 countries were affiliated with this competition, and its aim was to embrace all impairments in the future and to act as a coordinating committee. But it just took a long time for this really good idea about what the Stoke Mandeville Games and ultimately the Paralympic Games could become actually turned into a competition that we now recognise.
Yeah, and the 1960 Rome Games set a new pattern whereby the Stoke Mandeville Games would take place in the UK 3 years out of 4, with the Olympic Year Games taking place in the Olympic host country, but not always. For instance, in 1980, the Summer Olympics were taking place in Soviet Russia, but they declined to host the Paralympics. There were apparently no invalids in the USSR, so the Games that year were held in the Netherlands. They also didn't participate in the 1984 Paralympics on the same grounds, but miraculously, they did manage to find some disabled Soviet athletes in time to join the 1988 Games, which were the first ones to be officially branded the Paralympic Games. In fact, there had been all sorts of names beforehand, including the 1976 Toronto Olympiad, when Toronto was possibly too excited to be hosting the Games. But yes, it was 1988 in Seoul that the Paralympics became the official brand.
And you started seeing some proper competition because people did start looking in their own nations to sponsor invalids, as they put it there in the USSR, whereas before that it was kind of either part of your treatment program or it was self-appointed, wasn't it? Someone who was very headstrong would say, I want to participate in sport, but then they'd sort of then end up participating in everything. I mean, if you look at the big winner of this Paralympics in 1960, it was Maria Scuti of Italy, who'd lost the use of her legs. She won 15 medals in total, including 10 golds. So, I mean, she really had to go at everything and won everything because there weren't that many competitors. So you are really talking about the 1980s by the time this gathered steam, not with any disrespect to anyone who won a gold medal before then, but, as a genuine international competition.
Yeah, and also I think that's reinforced, that growing sense of competition, by the fact that the Paralympics have also faced their own problem with steroid use. And at the 2008 Beijing Games, 3 powerlifters and a German basketball player were banned for positive drug tests. This was actually an improvement from the 2000 Games, where 10 powerlifters and a track athlete were banned. A German skier called Thomas Oelsner, who won 2 gold medals in the 2002 Winter Paralympics, was the first Winter Paralympian to test positive for steroids as well. So you had this sort of growth of the desire to win being overwhelmed by the same sorts of issues that have beset the actual games and many other sports as well, of kind of helping athletes to perform in ways that they ordinarily really shouldn't be able to.
But then the fact that people take it so seriously is an incredible victory for what was the Stoke Mandeville Games, isn't it? And is reflected in the fact that Stoke Mandeville is now honoured as the home of the Paralympics with the Paralympic torch, in the same way that ancient Greece is regarded as the origins of the Olympics. It's now the third largest sporting event in the world.
Yeah.
And actually, we should say that there had been Olympic athletes with disabilities before. One of the most remarkable was George Iser. He was a US gymnast who won 6 medals in one day at the 1904 Olympics, including 3 golds in parallel bars, vault and rope climbing, despite the fact that he had lost his leg in a train accident and was competing with a wooden prosthesis. But that legacy of Stoke Mandeville does continue in the World Ability Sport Games. That continues the original legacy of a parasport tournament specifically for competitors with spinal cord injuries. It was later expanded to include amputees as well. That still takes place annually in the non-Paralympic years. So there is still that original legacy of those Stoke Mandeville Games.
But do they still play darchery? That's what I want to
Really
know.
hope so. Why isn't that in the
hope so.
Olympics?
And exactly.
Yeah.
And where do you put your pint on a wheelchair?